There is a particular kind of institutional silence that speaks louder than any press release ever could. It is the silence of a league that announces sweeping rule changes across multiple officiating categories simultaneously, uses careful, neutral language to describe each one, and never once mentions the name of the player whose entire rookie season made every single one of those changes necessary. The Women's National Basketball Association did exactly that when it rolled out its updated officiating standards heading into the 2025 season. Flagrant foul criteria, hand-checking enforcement, expanded review procedures, moving screen clarifications. 4 distinct areas of officiating, all tightened, all strengthened, all announced in the measured vocabulary of institutional improvement. And every single one of them pointed directly at what happened to Caitlyn Clark. She never asked for this. She never lobbied for protection in press conferences or used post-game interviews to pressure the league into acting. She took the hits, absorbed the contact, played through an officiating environment that her own league has now quietly but officially admitted was inadequate, and still produced the most statistically significant rookie season in WNBA history. The league changed the rules. The rules did not need to say her name. Everything else already had. To understand what the rule changes actually mean, you have to understand the full picture of what Caitlyn Clark's rookie season looked like from start to finish, not as a collection of highlight clips or isolated incidents that made national news, but as a documented, sequential, statistically verifiable pattern that built across an entire professional season. It started before anyone outside of women's basketball was paying serious attention. In the earliest weeks of the 2024 WNBA season, analysts and dedicated fans who were watching complete games rather than curated clips began noticing a specific pattern in how officiating was being applied when Caitlyn Clark was on the ball. Hand-checking that drew immediate whistles for other guards at her position was being allowed to continue when the recipient was Clark. Hard-off ball screens with elbow contact that referees were flagging in other matchups during the same games were being swallowed when set against her. Late contact on jump shots that produced free throw opportunities for other players was going uncalled when the shooter was Clark. These observations were not impressionistic. They were tracked, filmed, analyzed, and published by credible outlets during the season itself. The gap between what the rulebook described and what was being enforced in practice was not a matter of fan perception shaped by emotional investment. It was a documented discrepancy that showed up consistently across games, across referees, and across opponents. Then came June, and the Chennedy Carter moment that broke through to mainstream national sports coverage in a way nothing before it had. A hard-off ball body check, away from the play, away from the ball, contact that made no basketball sense outside of its obvious purpose. The video circulated immediately. It stayed on every major sports network for days. It became the central reference point in a national conversation about whether the most commercially significant player in the history of women's basketball was being adequately protected by the officials assigned to her games. But here is what the national coverage of that moment consistently failed to communicate. The Carter incident was not an isolated event that came from nowhere. It was the most visible point in a pattern that had been building for months. It was the moment the dam broke publicly on a story that people inside women's basketball had been watching develop since the first week of the season. Treating it as a standalone controversy rather than as the peak of an established pattern allowed the broader conversation to reset after a few news cycles, as if the problem had been identified, discussed, and resolved, when in fact the pattern continued. What also continued, and what deserves to be stated clearly because it is one of the more remarkable individual sports stories of the past decade, was Caitlyn Clark's production. She led the WNBA in assists as a rookie. She ranked among the leaders in scoring. She drove attendance records at venues across the league, including road venues where she was playing against the home crowd. She did all of this while absorbing more physical attention than any other player in the league. While operating in an officiating environment, the league itself has now officially characterized as needing correction. And while never once using the media access available to her to complain, pressure officials, or lobby for different treatment. She just kept producing, and eventually the institution responsible for the environment she was producing inside had no choice but to respond. The WNBA's official language around the rule changes was everything you would expect from a league navigating a politically complex institutional acknowledgement. Careful, neutral, forward-looking, framed entirely as improvement to the overall product rather than as a response to any specific situation or player. Read through the language, though, and match the specific areas of change against the specific documented patterns of Clark's rookie season, and the picture that emerges requires no interpretation. It is simply accurate. The tightening of flagrant foul criteria removed a significant portion of referee discretion that had been exercised with remarkable and documented inconsistency throughout the 2024 season. Previous standard allowed individual referees wide latitude in determining whether contact rose to the level of a flagrant assessment. The new standard defines thresholds that require flagrant calls regardless of individual judgment about intent or severity. The subjectivity that allowed certain plays to go uncalled has been structurally reduced. The strengthening of hand-checking enforcement addressed a pattern that was tracked with statistical discipline across the entire 2024 season. The frequency with which Clark was subjected to extended arm and hand contact designed to impede her movement was documented in film analysis that multiple outlets published both during and after the season. The new enforcement standards require referees to call hand-checking at a lower threshold of contact than was being applied. For any guard whose game is built on pace and the ability to operate at full speed through open space, this change is not minor. It is fundamental. The expansion of review procedures created a structural accountability mechanism that did not exist at the same level before. This matters because it means that patterns of missed calls can now be tracked, monitored, and corrected across a season in ways that were previously much harder to formalize. It is a systemic change rather than a rule change in the strictest sense, but it addresses the same core problem: officiating inconsistency that compounds across games and has measurable effects on individual players. The clarification of moving screen and off-ball contact standards addressed two specific categories that players, coaches, and analysts had identified as documented patterns of concern during the 2024 season. The clarifications are technical in their language, but their practical application is straightforward. Contact that the rulebook already described as illegal is now going to be called with greater consistency across all games and all matchups. Here is the sentence that matters most in understanding what all of this means collectively. You do not simultaneously tighten flagrant foul criteria, strengthen hand-checking enforcement, expand review processes, and clarify moving screen standards after a season in which none of those things were problems for anyone except the player who was targeted by all of them at the same time. The league did not say her name. It did not need to. The specific architecture of the changes said everything the official language was carefully designed not to say directly. Institutions confess differently than individuals do. They do not sit across a table, make eye contact, and say plainly that something went wrong on their watch. They issue policy updates. They announce operational improvements. They describe enhanced standards and strengthened enforcement in language calibrated to frame correction as progress rather than as accountability. But the act of changing a standard is itself the confession. Every person who has ever been responsible for running an organization at any level understands this intuitively. You do not fix what was not broken. The fixing is the acknowledgement that something was broken. The specific things you choose to fix tell you exactly what the problem was. The WNBA fixed its flagrant foul criteria. That is an institutional admission that the previous criteria were being applied in ways that did not adequately protect players from the contact those criteria were designed to prevent. It is an admission that the protection the rulebook promised was not being delivered consistently in practice. The WNBA fixed its hand-checking enforcement standards. That is an admission that hand-checking was being permitted at levels the existing rules never intended to allow. It is an acknowledgement that defenders were operating with physical latitude that the rulebook had already withdrawn, and that officials were not consistently restoring. The WNBA expanded its review processes. That is an admission that plays were being missed in real time at a frequency and consequence that required a structural solution, rather than an expectation that individuals would perform better without any mechanism for accountability. None of these admissions will ever appear in plain language in any official WNBA document, but they are now part of the permanent institutional record, sitting alongside the season in which Caitlyn Clark experienced a nationally covered, statistically documented pattern of targeted physical play that the league's own rule changes now describe with precision. That record cannot be revised. It cannot be softened in future media guides. It exists, and it says exactly what it says. For everyone who spent the 2024 season being told they were overreacting, being told the targeting was a projection of bias, being told the officiating was consistent, and their perception was distorted by emotional investment in a specific player. The word for this moment is vindication. Not the small, satisfying kind that comes from winning an online argument. The documented, institutionally recorded, officially permanent kind that comes when the organization responsible for the problem puts its own corrections in writing. The pushback from within the league following the rule change announcement was neither subtle nor slow. It came from multiple directions with genuine emotional force. And it is, without intending to be, the most revealing confirmation of the argument that the rule changes themselves could not state directly. Some of the anger is tactical, and it has at least surface-level coherence. There are teams in the WNBA whose defensive identity was constructed around physical, aggressive play, tight hand checking on ball handlers, hard screens designed to punish cutters and disrupt offensive timing, a style that crowds offensive players and creates difficulty through contact rather than through positioning, footwork, and defensive anticipation. These teams made personnel decisions based on a defensive approach that the new officiating standards are going to make considerably harder to execute. Players were signed, coaches built their systems, and rosters were assembled around a style that the rule changes directly restrict. The tactical disruption is real, but here is what that tactical frustration actually reveals when you examine it honestly. If your defensive scheme was dependent on contact the rulebook already explicitly prohibited, if what you were counting on was not aggressive defense played within the rules but physical play that the existing rules restricted, and officials were simply not calling with consistency, then your anger about the rule changes is not really anger about the rules changing. It is anger about the rules being enforced. Those are fundamentally different complaints, and the distinction between them exposes the entire argument. No team that was playing physical defense within the actual boundaries the rulebook describes should have any reason to be angry about stricter enforcement of those boundaries. The anger is an inadvertent admission that the physical play being protected was never within those boundaries to begin with. There is a deeper dimension to the resistance that deserves direct acknowledgement. The physical style that the new rules restrict has been a feature of WNBA defensive basketball for years. Some veteran players built their professional identities around it. Some coaches built entire systems and recruiting philosophies around it. Being told that the style needs to change carries implications that go beyond tactical adjustment. It suggests that something previously accepted as normal was actually a problem that required correction. That is genuinely harder to accept than a schematic tweak, and the emotional force of some of the pushback reflects that difficulty more honestly than the tactical arguments do. But harder to accept does not mean incorrect, and the league's decision to enforce its own rulebook consistently, applied universally to every player and every matchup, is not favoritism toward any individual. It is the baseline requirement of a professional sports organization that intends to be taken seriously. The most direct impact on Caitlyn Clark's game is straightforward to describe and significant to understand fully. Her playing style at its highest level is built around pace, space, and the ability to operate at full speed without accounting for contact the rules already prohibit. She reads the floor faster than almost any guard in the league. She sees passing lanes and driving windows that players at her level do not process until the opportunity has already closed. That processing speed creates advantages for herself and her teammates that compound across a game and across a season in ways that go far beyond simple individual statistics. That game reaches its actual ceiling only when she can operate in the space the rules are designed to protect. During the 2024 season, she was spending real cognitive and physical energy managing contact that should have been generating whistles. Every adjustment she made to account for uncalled hand checking, every release point modification she developed to work around late contact on jump shots, every routing change she made to avoid moving screens that officials were allowing to stand, those were real costs. They represented the difference between Caitlyn Clark performing at a high level and Caitlyn Clark performing at her ceiling. She produced historic rookie numbers while paying those costs. Remove them, and what you get is something the WNBA has not fully seen yet. For teams whose defensive schemes were built around the contact the new rules restrict, the challenge is fundamental rather than tactical. Creative coaching staffs with flexible rosters will find ways to be disruptive within the new standards. But teams whose defensive identity was specifically constructed around tight physical harassment of ball handlers face a structural problem that cannot be solved with a scheme adjustment. It requires roster changes, philosophical rebuilds, and multiple off-seasons of patient construction. The league's competitive landscape is going to shift, and the direction of that shift is not difficult to predict. The commercial dimension of these changes is being almost entirely ignored in mainstream coverage, and it deserves to be stated plainly. The WNBA recently signed a landmark media rights deal, a deal that reflected what broadcast partners believed the product was worth after Clark's rookie season transformed the league's viewership numbers in ways no one inside the institution had fully anticipated. Those broadcast partners are not passive investors. They have financial interests in the quality and consistency of what is being shown on their platforms. A Caitlyn Clark playing in a properly officiated environment, operating at her actual ceiling rather than constantly adjusting to uncalled contact, is a more compelling broadcast product than what those partners received in 2024. The rule changes serve the commercial infrastructure the league just built, and that alignment between competitive integrity and commercial interest is not coincidental. It is what properly functioning sports institutions look like when they are operating correctly. Caitlyn Clark's impact on the next generation of women's basketball players extends beyond the visibility she created and the commercial transformation she accelerated. It extends to the specific institutional changes her presence forced. The players coming through college programs right now, many of which are recruiting at historic levels in part because of what Clark demonstrated was possible for women in professional basketball, will enter a league with properly enforced officiating standards rather than the environment their predecessor had to navigate as a rookie. They will play in an environment where the hand checking that follows a ball handler through every possession draws consistent whistles, where moving screens that compromise off-ball movement get called, where hard late contact on shooters produces free throws rather than dead balls and new possessions. Clark did not get that environment. She got a season of documented inconsistency that the league has since officially acknowledged was inadequate. She produced historic numbers inside that environment anyway. And in doing so, she demonstrated the commercial and competitive stakes clearly enough that the institution responsible for setting standards had no choice but to raise them. That is a specific kind of contribution to the sport that goes beyond any individual season's statistics. It is the kind of thing that shapes what the league looks like for everyone who comes after. The WNBA announced its rule changes with language calibrated to frame them as institutional progress rather than institutional accountability. That is how leagues always do these things. That is how organizations with political complexity and stakeholder relationships always manage their public communications when they are acknowledging, without explicitly acknowledging, that something went wrong. But the record is the record. The changes are official. The specific areas they address correspond with documented precision to the specific officiating patterns of one player's rookie season. And the institutional acknowledgement embedded in every one of those changes, the confession that lives inside the policy language, is now permanent. Caitlyn Clark did not need the rules to change to prove herself. She already proved herself under conditions her own league has since admitted were inadequate, and she did it while leading the WNBA in assists, driving historic attendance numbers across the entire league, and forcing a national conversation about women's basketball that had never existed at that scale before. The rules changed anyway. They changed because what she survived, and what she produced while surviving it, made it impossible for the league to continue without addressing what everyone watching could see. The biggest question in women's basketball is no longer whether Caitlyn Clark can handle the WNBA. She answered that question during a rookie season, played in conditions the league itself has now officially corrected. The question now is what happens when she finally gets to play under the standards the rulebook intended all along. If what she did without those standards was historic, what comes next may not have a word for it yet. The WNBA changed flagrant foul criteria, hand-checking enforcement, review procedures, and moving screen standards all at once after one season. They never mentioned Caitlyn Clark by name. They didn't have to. What part of this story do you think mainstream sports media is most consistently getting wrong? Drop it below. Subscribe if you want analysis that goes deeper than the headlines.